Recording started.
There will be a paper, there is a paper produced by both of our speakers this afternoon which we can email to you at the end of the conference call. Just simply email BRPConf and we can send that through to you after the call has finished. Both speakers have got 15 minutes to cover their topic. They've been well briefed and we'll keep to time. We'll take a few questions after each speaker and then we'll round off the conference call at the end with a general question session if we haven't covered all the questions, hoping to finish about 2:15. So it's 1:30. I think we'll start the call and I'll ask Simon Marsh to just quickly introduce himself and give us his talk on maize production in beef systems.
Thanks, Chris. This is Simon Marsh, lecturer at Harper Adams University, and I do all the teaching and research here at Harper. Okay, right. Maize is a proven forage and ideal basically for finishing cattle, and can produce very good growth rates and also improve margins. Definition of good quality maize, or that should be fed for beef cattle, will be about 30-35% dry matter, and also that area and region for starch content. If you look at the sort of the research work that's been carried on, because the question I often get is, how does maize size compare to grass size? How does it compare to whole crop? If you look at the research work that's been conducted on these various forages, it all depends on the actual analysis and quality of the feeds forages used in those experiments. Invariably, most of the research work has compared good quality grass silage against good quality maize silage against medium quality grass silage. And you don't need to be a rocket scientist to work out that, yes, replacing grass silage or whole crop with maize silage will give improved performance. One particular experiment done in Northern Ireland where they compared replacing grass silage with poor quality maize, no surprise, obviously, no improvement in performance. So the key message here would be is, okay, whereas maize silage will give excellent results, is grow the forage that gives you the highest dry matter and ME yield on your farm. In terms of finishing cattle, which we'll focus on in the main, if you look at sort of maize silage and how it's fed across Europe, the common recipe would be ad lib maize silage and about 3 kilos of an 18% protein concentrate, because that, as most people will be aware, is one of the downsides of maize, that it's relatively low in crude protein content. So, yep, it's commonly used in Northern Europe, and I've been to Germany and France and seen many farms and use that simple recipe for finishing cattle successfully. We did a study here at Harper to actually say, well, what is the ideal level of concentrates that you need to finish cattle on maize silage? And this was a study we did with young bulls. They were about 225 kilos at the start. These were predominantly Holstein bulls. And we looked at diets containing 50% forage, 50% concentrate, or 75% forage and 25% concentrate. Obviously, the diets were balanced so that they both provided the same amount of protein. In sort of round figures, roughly the 50-50 diet on a dry matter basis fed roughly about 5.5 kilos of a 15% protein concentrate. The diet, which was 75% maize, 25% concentrate, was roughly 2.5 kilos of a 22% protein concentrate. And what we found from the study was that there was no difference in performance. So in other words, we could fairly minimise concentrate feed levels. We finished bulls with adequate fat cover. They all finished about fat class 3. And with carcass weights just under 300 kilos. So yeah, good quality maize can reduce the amount of concentrates that you feed. But the key thing with this particular study with finishing young bulls is that the average age at slaughter was just over 15 months, which compares to sort of 13.5 months for our barley or cereal-fed bulls. These bulls, obviously at 15 months of age, there'd be a risk of the odd one being 16 months, and of course now most abattoirs heavily penalise bulls that are more than 16 months old. So that's the slight downside, although compared to our barley-fed bulls, the carcass weights were about 10 kilos heavier. Looking at finishing, for example, other breed types on maize silage, really the issue to consider will be making sure there's adequate protein, particularly this ERDP protein that we can get from rapeseed meal, distillers, pod oil syrup, even a small quantity of urea. But be careful with urea. We're only talking of feeding maybe 100 grams a day, so you're looking at it being fed in a TMR to make sure that it's fed throughout the day to avoid any problems. In terms of sort of, say, for example, continental heifers and those breed types, all you'd need is about a kilo and a half of a 35% protein concentrate to finish those heifers successfully. they'll be getting adequate levels of energy provided from the maize silage. With regard to native breeds and other breed types, we generally would be looking to feed that maize silage with a lower energy density forage to lower the energy density to avoid the cattle getting over fat too quickly. So again, there'll be a range of diets, but yeah, it'll give good results. But obviously, get a nutritionist to look at the diets for those other breed types to finish them on a maize silage based diet. Have to say, in terms of maize silage for store cattle, dry cows, obviously, if it doesn't make sense to feed it to these cattle. The only way you'd be feeding it is if you had it there and you had there to use it. But you would definitely need to dilute the energy from the maize to avoid overfeeding both the store cattle if you're looking for, say, 0.5, 0.8 kilo a day growth rate, or with suckler cows, depending whether you're looking to hold condition or maybe even lose condition with suckler cows. So yeah, you'd have to really dilute the energy down with another forage and some straw, but obviously bear in mind making sure the protein levels are adequate. Lactating suckler cows, maize silage can be used, but I say there's not many people who will do that throughout the country. I know just a handful of farmers who've fed maize silage to lactating suckler cows. But again, look towards formulating a diet with about 140 megajoules of energy supply with a protein of about 12, 13 to 14%. Another issue with regard to maize, and say the title was Maize in Beef Systems, is maize grain or grain maize. Now, maize grain is really only, I'm afraid, just for growers really in the south and maybe in the Midlands under plastic. But it is rocket fuel for beef cattle. It is absolute rocket fuel. Because the beauty of maize, which I didn't point out earlier, is that about 35% of the starch is bypass starch, compared to barley, where only about 15% of the starch is what we call bypass starch, that bypasses the rumen and goes straight to the small intestine. That will in effect help reduce or minimise any problems with acidosis, and that's what makes maize a very safe feed. Going back to work we've done here at Harper, we did a study finishing some bulls on grain maize. We looked at it back in, I think it was like 2007, when they closed the sugar beet factory here at Shrewsbury, and the arable growers were looking for an alternative crop to sugar beet. Hence, there was an interest in growing grain maize under plastic to grow grain, and at that time barley was about £170 a tonne, so it made economic sense to do it. Fed 2 pens of bulls, one groups of bulls, one on our traditional barley mix, the other on grain maize mix. Again, added balance with protein to about sort of 12 to 14% in the dry matter, using a bit of soy and rape. The barley-fed bulls grew at about 1.3 kilos a day. The maize grain-fed bulls grew at 1.5 kilos a day. Within a month, you could see the bloom on the coats and see the improvement there. Also, we followed all our cattle who were to slaughter, looking for abscesses, and there were no liver abscesses with the maize grain-fed bulls. But with the barley-fed bulls, yes, there were some abscesses. So, yeah, confirming this issue of acidosis potentially with barley. Another interesting feature of that study was that the grain maize-fed bulls ate a similar quantity of feed per day, bearing in mind the grain maize was about 66% dry matter compared to the barley mix. So the dry matter intakes were lower, but yet they still recorded better before. So one can only assume that the maize grain was used more effectively and efficiently by the bulls with better conversion into live weight gain. So that's sort of an overall view on maize for beef cattle. Ideal for finishing bulls and finishing steers, excellent. Bearing in mind the protein content, and we finish bulls with just 2.5 kilos of a 20% protein concentrate. Where you're comparing it to grass and whole crop depends in the studies where we've done the research. What is the actual quality using experiments? So don't think that you can only finish, maize has to be the only forage you consider. You can equally finish cattle on grass sides and whole crop. Depends on the quality that you make and grow. In terms of breed types, again, summarising continental heifers, we can easily finish on a kilo and a half of a 35% protein concentrate, but native breed types we'll be looking to mix with another forage just to dilute the energy down, to let those animals grow a bit of frame, to then put some finish on once they've reached your target slaughter weights. So that's, I know I've probably finished just short of time, quickly in time, but that's my overall overview on maize in beef systems, and happy to take questions. Okay, Simon, can you hear me all right? Yeah, I can hear you, Chris, yeah. Had a few problems with my phone, so apologies to everyone. Yeah. Just to let everyone know, there is a manual which is on our BRP site. I think Simon has contributed some data to that in terms of rations.
That's on the eblex.org.uk site. If you click on the Better Returns button and click on Forage and Feeding, if you scroll down to the bottom, you'll find the generic manual number 10, Growing and Feeding Maize Silage for Better Returns. So that takes you through a lot of the agronomy, the establishment questions, the soil types and locations, and then, as I say, gets into some of the detail which Simon's covered with us again today in terms of rations. Simon, I've got a few questions come in, and just to remind everybody, if you've got questions for Simon, we have access to his expertise this afternoon. Email your question to brpconf@eblex.ahdb.org.uk, or you can text us on 07973 701 211. So, Simon, just to kick off the questions, I've got a question about harvesting here. Should I be trying to harvest my maize crop when it contains the maximum starch content, and how would I know when that would be?
Right. In terms of when to harvest, and the targets are about 30 to 35% dry matter and starch content. So obviously, the longer you leave the crop, the more starch will create. But you then run into dangers of harvesting late season when the weather may be adverse and may be more difficult. You are basically looking at the grain where you can only force, when your thumbnail can just be forced into the grain with some difficulty. So that's giving you an idea when you're at that dry matter content. When you actually look at the grain itself and you actually open up the kernels, the inside will be doughy rather than sort of doughy to hard dough, and what we call the milk line. This is the yellowing within the grain. The milk line is at least a third, if not towards a half, of that grain. So that would be the stage that I'd be harvesting at about that optimum. Because with much higher dry matter contents, you may have storage clamping problems and issues that could occur, and really generally 30-35% dry matter and starch would be the ideal, in my opinion.
Okay, and just finishing on, carrying on with the starch content theme, what would you recommend is the minimum starch content of maize silage for finishing cattle? As with all, as with all forages, obviously there can and is variation, from good, bad to very good. What would I view as being sort of the minimum? I would really want it to be at least 20%, but in the study they did in Ireland, they actually compared, believe it or not, some maize silage with a 22% dry matter content and only 9% starch. They replaced medium quality grass silage, and obviously that had no effect on performance, but that's as low as they went. But I would be looking for ideally minimum 20, but obviously once you've installed it, what's in your clamp, that is what you've got, and you therefore supplement accordingly. Obviously the better the starch content, the less concentrate you can get away with. The study that we did here at Harper, with different levels of concentrate, that was with good maize at 11.2 ME and about 34% starch. So again, dropping the starch content may mean you may need to supplement it a bit higher level for your finishing cattle. I got a question about that trial, Simon. What age were the bulls when they were put onto the grain maize, and was that just maize plus protein? Was it just the maize silage?
The grain maize or the maize silage? The grain maize? Those bulls... The grain maize?
It's not specific. It just says on bull finishing diets, what age were the bulls put on the grain maize, and what was the maize plus protein?
Right.
Is that just maize plus protein?
Yeah. I'll cover both studies we did. On the grain maize study, the bulls were 360 kilos, so in other words, about 9 months of age, and all we added to that diet was a bit of soya and a bit of rape and mineral, so nothing else added. They had straw available from racks to feed, but to say we will always offer straw in racks, but it wasn't involved, including the TMO, so that's all it was. On the study we did with maize silage, those bulls were 225 kilos, in other words, sort of roughly about 5.5 months of age, and they went right the way through to slaughter on just as ad lib maize with concentrates. On that sort of subject, and people who are fattening young bulls, I know that sometimes the temptation is to, if cereal prices go high, it's often a reaction to go, let's look at high energy forages to finish those cattle. People on the young bull beef system, I would always advise keep these young bulls on ad lib cereal based diets from sort of 3 months of age to 6, 7, 8 months of age. At that phase in their life, we've got bulls at 6-7 months of age growing on about 1.8, 1.9, 2 kilos per day. They're converting feed at about 3.5 to 1. So keep them on ad lib cereals to about 5, 6, 7 months of age, because that period of life they're converting feed incredibly efficiently. Why feed forages in that case? And make the most of the high growth rate potential with cereals, then put them onto the alternatives. But forage grain or grain maize, yeah, from 3 months of age right the way through. No problems at all with that.
Just a quick question on maize grain.
Yes.
Maize grain itself. Does that need rolling when putting into a ration?
Yes. What we did with the maize grain, that it was went through a mill, and the grains were cracked. We also, in our particular experiment, used an inoculant to make sure and ensure that we had good preservation of the clamp. Similar principles to making any side within a clamp, rolling, getting the air out, and clamping well. Yep.
Just on alternatives to go with maize silage, any comments on using red clover or lucerne silage together with maize silage?
It's something I would like to look at. In theory, they will work well together. You look at the studies, particularly with lambs that have been grown on red clover, and they've achieved very good results. The two, either red clover, lucerne, mixed with maize, could be an ideal combination, because you're getting obviously the protein contribution from both the red clover and the lucerne. We grow lucerne here at Harper. We grow about 100 acres of lucerne, because sometimes we've got land that's very dry, or we're in a low rainfall because of the deep rooting of the lucerne. We have made some brilliant lucerne silage, but occasionally we've made some poor lucerne silage, because obviously as a crop, going to its ensiling characteristics, it's high protein, low sugar, high buffering capacity, and can, if you don't get sunshine and a quick wilt and a rapid wilt, end up with some not brilliant material within the clamp. So made well, fantastic stuff. So yeah, could work ideal, Chris, in a combination with maize, and really minimise the concentrate use. And particularly, obviously, as you know, proteins are more expensive than energy feeds, can again reduce costs. But it would depend on your ability to grow and harvest and ensile either red clover or lucerne.
Yeah. I suppose you're looking at that really for the protein, aren't you? You're
yes.
just trying to bump the protein up in the ration, so it depends what you're feeding it to.
Yeah.
So, just to remind everybody, we've got Simon here. He's a mine of information, as you've gathered, firing facts and figures at us. Simon's notes from today will be available at the end of the call. Just email us at that brpconf at eblex.ahdb.org.uk. We've got one more question for Simon, but if you've got questions for Simon or you think of them, email them in, or you can text us on 07973 701 211. Simon, last question we've got at the moment regarding contractors and actually harvesting again. What should I be checking for good maize silage in terms of chop length and cracked grains? Any sort of guide there?
Yeah, you really, once the contractors start to come in the field, look at the first few trailer loads that are coming into the clamp, checking that chop length is about that half inch, maybe inch maximum, but half inch would be the guide, and they've got their corn cracker is working, because if that grain doesn't get cracked, there's a fair chance that most of those grains will go straight through the animal. So the key thing is being on the ball. First couple of trailer loads, come in, have a look, get in there, check your chop length, check the grains have been cracked, and then that will be ideal.
Great. Okay, Simon, will you stay with us on the call?
Yes,
we'll hand over to Liz now, who's going to give us some tips and thoughts on earlier turnout. Liz Genever.
Hello, everybody. I'm Liz Genever. As said, I've been working with EBLEX for the last few years and have become slightly obsessed with grass and forage in probably the last 5 to 6. So I'm going to be talking this afternoon about earlier turnout. And there tends to be a tendency within the beef industry to wait until a certain day, perhaps in May or June, and turn everything out at once. It almost seems to be that job you do on 1 or 2 days and then it's done. It can become a bit of a vicious cycle as more and more land is needed to shut up silage to withstand the long winter, which means there's less land available in the spring for grazing. And it does need to be tackled via a whole system approach, and we're very much going to talk about early turnout now, and I would encourage people to think about it, but we've really got to start planning. The planning started 6 months ago, so we just also have to think about that. And it doesn't mean chucking all animals out in mid-February and letting them get on with it. It can mean turning out a proportion of animals a week or so earlier than previous years, and then with increasing confidence and planning, that date may be moved further still. And at grass growing animals, as the grass starts to grow, animals can then be trickled out rather than waiting for them all to be turned out together. The getting animals out earlier has many benefits. It can reduce feed and wintering cost, it can improve future grass yields through stimulating further growth, and increase total live weight gain from grass. It could be argued that the difference in cost between a housed animal and one at grass is about £1 a day, so savings of £30 plus can be made quite simply. So what we do know, and point one is really planning is important. So fields need to really be monitored from late winter, and so decisions can be made about grass availability. We know that grass is growing quite well, and then obviously the cold snap that we're just experiencing has shut quite that grass growth down. It is likely that south-facing fields that were not grazed from late September, October time with good soil structure and fertility would be the ones most likely to be suitable for earlier turnout. In a perfect world, these would be close to buildings or handling facilities in case animals need to be brought back in. In grass-based dairy systems, they start planning for earlier turnout in the autumn, as they want to build a small wedge to take through to the spring to allow them to graze earlier. They remove all stock from the grazing platform and do not allow winter grazing of sheep, as this winter growth is extremely valuable to them to allow them to get animals out earlier. This same approach could be used for beef systems, with forage crops being used to remove all stock off the grazing platform for the winter, but this planning needs to start the spring before that we're really wanting to turn those animals out. A common complaint with earlier turnout is that grass just disappears once the cattle are out. Unsurprisingly, it is all about supply and demand. Growing cattle should be allocated at least 3% of their body weight in terms of dry matter intake. So, for example, a 300 kilo grower needs around 9 kilos of dry matter per day. And in March, grass may be growing at between 5 and 15 kilos of dry matter per hectare per day. So this sort of indicates the required stocking rate if that wedge of grass has not been built up and then maintained. So, sort of as I'm illustrating, earlier turnout needs to be part of a well-planned approach to maximising the use of grass, and it shouldn't just be seen as a competition with local producers of who could get cattle out earliest. The second point really is to measure and monitor sward heights. We know based on standard sward heights, the ideal pre-grazing sward height for beef cattle early in the season is 8 to 10 centimetres, with 5 to 6 centimetres being the ideal post-grazing sward height. And this is when you use a sword stick that to the ground, and then you measure where the leaf hits, the highest point of the leaf hits that sword stick. And these are targets for rotational grazing really, so we're thinking basically 8 to 10 and bringing down to 5 to 6. If we're set stocking or continuously grazing, we actually only want it to be 5 to 6 centimetres, which is generally significantly shorter than most people would turn stock out to. But care is needed to make sure stocking rate fits the growth, as illustrated before. So EBLEX and BRP have started to talk more about this compressed sword stick and kilos of dry matter per hectare. So this term is very, very frequently used within the dairy sector when talking about grass, and we're trying to get it used more and more in the beef and sheep sector. Basically, it is just a way of assessing grass and the amount of feed that's in front of you. So, and we have a compressed sward stick that can be used to assess pasture cover and kilos of dry matter per hectare. It works like a plate meter, apart from you use a hand or a clipboard to sort of compress that sward, and it will measure or assess the density of the sward. And it is extremely useful when allocating grass based on intakes, so that's why we're sort of moving towards that method really. For example, if a field is measured at 2,000 kilos of dry matter per hectare, and that is around 8 centimetres standard sward height, and the target residual is 1,500, and that's around 4 to 5 centimetres. When I say residual, that is the amount of grass that is left in that field when you take those animals out. And that the residual, especially within dairy systems, is the one area that they really focus on, because that really drives growth for the next rotation. So in this example, we start with 2,000, we want to take them out at 1,500. That means we have 500 kilos of available grass in the form of dry matter available. So if we're using the growers that we mentioned before with their 9 kilo demand, that would support about 10 growers for nearly 6 days. So 500 available kilos of dry matter divided by 9, which is their daily intake requirement, equals 56. 56 divided by 10 growers is 5.6 days, so roughly about 6 days. So this approach, and we can do this per field, and we can do it per rotation or group or anything, and that really starts to help us plan how many animals to turn out onto what area. Sword height should be assessed weekly, especially at this time of year when the situation can change very rapidly, especially if the weather becomes colder, if that currently is possible. Tracking them on a piece of paper or on a graph can be very useful, as it means that decisions can be made earlier and crucially before the grass runs out. The point number 3 is to avoid sword damage. The crucial aspect of earlier turnout is to do everything possible to prevent damage to the sword through poaching. So matching stock type, be that weight and size, and stocking density to the soil conditions of the field is extremely important. Rule of thumb, the heavier the soil, the lighter the stock. Growing cattle, perhaps wean calves, had the highest priority due to their small size and high feed conversion efficiency. Then older growing cattle, replacement heifers, cows and calves, with dry cows having the lowest priority. Consider keeping animals that are less than 100 kilos from their finished weight housed, but this will depend on your system and your feed availability. The success of grass-based dairy systems is reliant on investing in infrastructure, such as trackways and multiple entrances into fields. This is trying to maximise the number of grazing days and to avoid poaching. This approach can be used in beef systems, which do actually have the advantage of not having to move stock in and out twice per day towards the milking parlour. So we don't necessarily need a massive and extensive pathway of tracks, but some are required, and certainly multiple field entries are incredibly useful. Research from Northern Ireland has shown that allowing dairy cows to graze for 2 hours per day in the early season means that silage requirements are reduced by 25%, with no impact on yield and milk quality. This has the advantage of reducing the time the animals are out, so reducing the risk of poaching while reducing feed costs. This approach could be used in beef systems, but the correct infrastructure would be needed, or the end result would be particularly poached gateways. And obviously it depends on the position of house in relation to field. Consideration needs to be given if buffer feeding silage or other conserved forages outside, as there will be a risk of damage, and that area should be designated as a sacrifice area and dealt with later in the season. The focus should be on getting the stocking rate correct, so buffer feeding is not required, but it's not always perfect. It may be worth checking soil structure later in the spring to ensure no damage. Ourselves and Derico have recently funded a development of a grassland soil assessment tool, and which helps producers assign a score to the soil once a hole has been dug, and that means that monitoring over time is possible. So it is now a 2, or it was a 3 and it's now a 2, that sort of thing. And we're just in the process of producing that, and it can be found soon on healthygrasslandsoils.org.uk. Point number 4, and consider rotational grazing. So it is important when grazing earlier to rotate animals around fields, as it allows grass to recover once those animals have been moved to the next field. It is important to ensure good utilisation of the grass, which can be achieved by adjusting stocking density while watching for sward damage. The speed of the rotation will depend on grass growth and the wedge that has been built. A rotation planner is available from BRP, which will help plan rotations. For example, if we had a 10-hectare field, which equates to 25 acres, and grass growth was around 10 kilos of dry matter per hectare per day, which is what we'd probably see in early spring. The pre-graze cover is 2,000, which, as I said earlier, is about 8 centimetres, and target residual is 1,500. The ambitious utilisation rate is around 75% of the grass that is there. And that is something that actually how you graze a system will affect that utilisation rate, and 75% is where we would like it to be on rotations, and realistically under continuous grazing we'd probably get 50 to 60%. So if this 10 hectares or 25 acres could be split into 8 paddocks, and that can be either with electric fencing, single strand, or by using established field boundaries and sort of adjusting paddock size slightly, each for around 2.5 hectares or 6 acres, and each grazed for 7 days. It would support 17 300 kilo growers, again allocated these 9 kilos of dry matter per day for 56 days. So it was So if this was started in March, it would last until the end of April, and it is likely that grass growth will increase in line with their increasing demand as they get heavier. But it may be that these animals need to move through the fields faster as the 6th, 7th and 8th paddocks may start to get away by the time it's planned to graze them. This could mean leaving a high residual, which so you take them out when it's higher than sort of probably at 6 to 7 centimetres, and you move the animals quicker. There is a variety of problems or variety of solutions to this problem, and that is turning more animals out to sort of match that demand to the supply that's there. The main advantage of rotational grazing allows us to graze fields to a target residual sward height, and that generally is around 5 centimetres or 15 kilos of dry matter, and this allows light to get to the next grass tillers and clover plants, and it will boost sward production. It also helps to prevent the accumulation of dead material in the bottom of the sward from leaves that haven't been eaten, and this will improve the quality of the grazing later in the season. Provision of water tends to be the major limiting factor in the use of rotational grazing systems on beef farms. Again, grass-based dairy systems will prioritise investment in water tanks alongside fencing. Good systems are available for beef cattle that involve running water pipes along the surface with watering troughs that can plumb in at various points along the pipe. Obviously there is a frost risk still in early spring, but there are options out there that certainly can be used within rotational systems for beef cattle. So point number 5 is how we start to use fertiliser or nutrients, and very much strategic applications of fertiliser, of nitrogen fertiliser or slurry in late February, early March will help to stimulate grass growth, and will be most cost effective on swards with a high proportion of ryegrass because it uses nitrogen more efficiently than other species. Soil temperature drives the response to nitrogen, and with soil temperatures higher than 5 degrees Celsius for 5 days leading to a good response to nitrogen, and that could be 12 kilos of dry matter for every 1 kilo of nitrogen applied. What we have seen in previous springs is that the soil temperatures get to 5 degrees for 5 consecutive days, and then there's a period of time when they drop back down again. And so that is something to watch out for, but if those soil temperatures are where they need to be, grass will respond to that applied nutrient. So we could argue an application of around 50 kilos of N to areas that favour early growth, i.e. not grazed hard over the winter, south-facing, well-drained, light soils with good fertility, will achieve the best results. Soil conditions need to be monitored carefully to avoid wilt damage. For example, applications to heavier soils may have to be made later when conditions are drier. For soils with low phosphate levels, the addition of P can enhance the activity of the N fertiliser, whether that's from fertiliser or slurry. Do not use any more than 80 to 90 kilos per hectare, which is 64 to 72 units per acre of potash or K fertiliser in the spring to grazing land, as it will increase the risk of grass staggers. It also could be worth checking soil and forage magnesium levels to ensure animal requirements can be met. If in any doubt, supply a magnesium supplement through a variety of different forms. So last point is number 6, which is think about grazing fields, which to some is some outrageous statements, but we know during the winter that ryegrass plants produce a new leaf about every 30 days. So it takes 90 days or 3 months for all of its leaves to be replaced, because the ryegrass plant only ever has 3 leaves actively growing at one point. These leaves grown during the winter tend to be less efficient at capturing sunlight than the spring-grown leaves. So it should be considered whether all fields should be grazed to remove winter leaves, which will help stimulate growth, and then fields can be shut up for conservation when appropriate. It is worth remembering that leaf emergence will increase during the early spring, and that means it will take 30 to 40 days to replace all 3 leaves rather than the 90 days during the winter. And by late spring, a leaf will be produced by every 7 to 10 days, so that leaf turnover increases dramatically. And this means that silage fields can recover quickly if they are grazed early enough within the year. Research from Northern Ireland has shown that grazing until the beginning of March has no impact on silage yield or quality. Grazing until mid-March, late March and mid-April will reduce silage yields by about 0.3, 0.65 and 1.3 tonnes of dry matter per hectare. So that's 0.3 for mid-March, 0.65 for late March, and 1.3 tonnes of dry matter if they graze until mid-April, and a 5, 10 or 21% reduction in silage quality. So if grazed till mid-March, there's a 5% reduction, late March 10% reduction, and mid-April a 21% reduction in silage quality. So this suggests that grazing silage fields until mid-March shouldn't necessarily have a big impact on silage yield or quality. When we move to later March, there is starting to get some significant drops. It is very easy to overgraze fields in the spring, especially if we haven't quite got our stocking rates sorted, and this will reduce their recovery rate. The subsequent yield and silage and delay the cutting date. This means that the residual of silage fields, so the amount that's left when we take those animals off, may need to be higher. So in grazing systems we're targeting 1500. In this situation we might be going for 1600, 1700, which is sort of 6-7 centimetres. And that allows us slightly quicker recovery, so we're not taking the plant as low, so it allows it to bounce back quicker. Although by grazing in the spring, early in the spring, and accepting a lower yield by cutting before the crop is fully bulked, silage quality can be higher. But if poaching has occurred, it will have an impact on silage yields. And again, work from Ireland has shown that heavy poaching in the spring will reduce total production by about 40% in silage fields. So in summary, early turnout does not mean chucking out all the animals in mid-February and letting them get on with it. It is a well-planned approach to reduce winter costs and getting more from grass, and it needs to be thought of as a trickle. Think about supply and demand, cautiously plan the number of animals that can be turned out for grazing. Monitoring fields is important to understand what grass is available and to ensure decisions can be made early if sward heights are dropping. Think the heavier the soil, the lighter the stock. Prioritise young, growing animals as they are the lightest and have the highest feed conversion efficiency. Check soil structure in the spring to assess if any damage has occurred. Consider rotationally grazing through paddocks so the grass has a chance to recover behind the stock and it is easier to budget feed. Investigate which fields could benefit from strategic applications of nitrogen and slurry, as when used on the correct swards it can be a very effective way to generate feed. Think about grazing silage fields as it appears to have no impact on silage fields as long as it's done before mid-March. Thank you very much.
Okay, Liz. I'm conscious there was a lot of information there, everybody. So if you want to receive either of the expert or both of the expert sheets from today's call, please email us at brpconf, that's CONF for Freddie, brpconf at eblex.ahdb.org.uk. Same email address if you want to email us through a question now for either Simon or for Liz. Or you can text your question to 07973 701 211. So we've got a few minutes now for questions until our allotted sort of end time. Simon, just to warn you, I've got one for you on variety choice. I'll come back to you in a minute. Just wanted to warm you up for that one. Liz, a couple of questions for you. I was thinking actually myself there, the key point, and I think you covered it in your summary, it's not necessarily an all-in, all-out kind of issue. It's about prioritising the grazing to the classes of stock as you see fit. And I think you covered there younger animals because they'll make most use of the improved feed. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's, I think because we're doing everything possible not to damage sward, we also need to think about by choosing the smaller animals, you are reducing the risk of soil damage compared to heavier stock, and there's a bit more flexibility so with them as well, so they can be brought in potentially if needed.
One question there come in. What happens if it goes wrong? So you've turned them out, the weather turns, the grazing you were planning to use starts to disappear. What would the implications be if you had to bring stock back in?
If you had to bring them in, there could be some form of check in relation to them readjusting back to the diet they've just taken them off. Depends on how long they're out for. But I think it is about that, removing the element of pride. There's nothing wrong with bringing those animals in if you think they are going to do significant sward and soil damage if they're left outside. So I do think that Plan B is very important, and choice of fields and ability to get those animals back in is very important as well. And yes, you could buffer feed outside if you needed to, but again, there is that risk of that localised activity causing some soil damage.
I was just going to ask that question. Is buffer feeding sort of advisable early on, just in case it goes wrong?
I think it's doing it very cautiously. So we know that we're not expecting grass to be growing 50, 60 kilos of dry matter per day at that time. So if we are cautiously approach stocking rates, and again this monitoring of sward height, so we know how much grass is there and we can see what's happening every week. It's just about getting bits of information, because at the moment we don't collect any of that information in terms of sward height generally. We wait until that grass is bulked up and it's somewhere near their knees, and then we're reassured there's going to be enough grass there. But I think if we could approach it with a handful of animals and just build our confidence that those animals can do extremely well on grass early on.
A couple of questions about soil damage. So I'm going to sort of summarise those. It's in terms of, considering how do you check if soil damage has happened? And my question, I was going to ask you to just repeat the link to that Healthy Soils document, because I think most of the questions about soil damage are covered in that document. What was the link again?
So it's a joint website with Dairyco, and it's called healthygrasslandsoils.org.uk. The sheet that we've done, basically we've worked with Newcastle University, ADAS and SRUC to generate a scoring system, and there's an A4 sheet that's also found on the EBLEX website within the BRP section that basically takes you through, and that the first port of call is to dig a hole and then gradually takes you through how to assess it, and then provides guidance in terms of once you've identified you've got a problem, what can you do about it. So, and it is during spring it can be a time to adjust to sort out soil damage, but to be fair, autumn is probably a better time to do it. So it's just worth monitoring those fields in the spring and then monitoring them again in the autumn to see whether natural processes have helped that soil recover, or you do have to intervene within the autumn.
Okay, just to come back to you, Simon, for a moment, if I may, if you're still with us.
Yep, still here.
So just thinking about variety choice, Simon, what would be the thoughts that would be going through your mind in terms of variety? I guess that's dependent on location and timing and everything else, but any thoughts on maize varieties?
Well, I'll hold my hand up here. I mean, my specialism is beef cattle production rather than agronomy or crop production. So what my basic knowledge would be is to say, obviously, looking to ensure that we have an appropriate early maturing variety to make sure we've got that level of starch there in the crop. So my thoughts would be is heading and moving towards the early maturing varieties, but depending, of course, where you are in the country. So difficult. I'm sorry to answer that specifically, Chris, because there's too many factors involved in terms of choice. Just to comment about the variety of grain that we used in the grain maize trial here at Harper was a variety called Benicia, if that means anything to you or to our listeners. But that was the variety we used for the grain maize.
Okay, and just to help Simon out there is quite a good section in the BRP maize manual. So if you go on the BRP website, feeding and forage, at the bottom of that page there you'll see manual number 10, and that does actually sort of cover quite a lot of the points there in terms of field location, field choice and varieties.
Sorry to interrupt, but if you go to look at the NIAB page, the NIAB.com, they'll also have their forage made descriptive list, which gives you all the information on the varieties that are available in the UK. Good
comment, Liz.
I can see everybody spending a nice afternoon in the warm this afternoon looking at lots of websites. Liz, one coming back to you regarding that Irish data you referred to. I think it was Northern Irish data trials on spring grazing. Yeah. Were the Irish data for effects on spring grazing on silage yields dependent on severity of grazings, and if so, were these quantified? Does that make sense to you?
It does, but I don't know the details. I can't remember the details. My assumption is that it was about access to grass, so they weren't overgrazed. But if you can send me the details of the person asking the question, I can find more out and get back to them.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, well, I think we're drawing to a close. If you've got any last-minute questions, you've got a couple of minutes just to send them in. Just a quick advert from EBLEX to let you know that we've got some beef events coming up, some synchronisation, AI and heifer management events. There's one at Kendal on the 25th of February. We've got one at Hexham on the 26th of February, Lyndhurst in the south on the 4th of March, and Warminster on the 5th of March. So Kendal, Hexham, Lyndhurst and Warminster, if they're in your area and you're interested in AI, synchronisation of cows and heifer management, please call our events office on 01904 771 211. If you're interested in any events that we run, we've got an events calendar on our website, but you can also call that number 01904 771 211. Make sure you're on the list to receive those invitations. Liz, I had one more question just to come back to you on. What should the live weight gain targets be for young cattle at grass in spring? That might be one that both of you want to cover, but Liz definitely, I'm sure.
The targets would be 1.2, 1.3 kilos per day for those animals. What we're finding is that, or the general advice is that in the spring we are able to achieve that quite easily. The challenge becomes on maintaining that through the summer. So I've got evidence from beef farmers who are grazing, especially red clover type swards, that are still maintaining that through the summer. So those growth rates are based on access to energy and dry matter. So it is about budgeting grass into those animals of the best quality all the way through the season, which is a lot easier said than done. Yeah. But we're very much expecting live weight gains of over 1.1, hopefully over 1.2 on grass in the early spring.
Okay, we've got a couple more questions coming, so I'm just going to extend the conference call for a bit longer. There's one here regarding sward sticks and plate meters. What's the difference between a compression sward stick and a plate meter?
A plate meter is £450 and a compressed sword stick is free.
Money? Yes.
So a plate meter, they have very much the same philosophy. The reason why we've gone for a compressed sword stick because of accessibility to more people, and secondly that most plate meters were designed to work on Canterbury plains for dairy type grass. So some of the beef and sheep farms that we're talking to here, during their fields aren't flat and they don't have that level of grass, and plate meters struggle when grass gets below 4 to 5 centimetres to measure it accurately. So that's why we've headed towards a sword stick. But they do a very similar job.
Okay, Liz, I'm going to ask this question because I think you'll understand it. I perhaps don't. Instead of leaving longer residuals when grass growth takes off, could you not shut up fields for silage and continue to graze down to 1,500 in the rest?
Yes.
Okay.
It depends a bit on. It depends on whether you want to. But yes, that is one of the very much the solution. So when grass starts to overtake your demand, yes, shutting up fields is a solution. Yeah.
One last question, Liz, for you. Why do you think late grazing of silage by cattle fields reduces quality? This person suggests that you would end up cutting younger grass with a higher D value if you grazed the cattle for longer.
Yeah, it was intriguing when I rediscovered those bits of information. I was thinking the same as the questioner, really, about that your cutting date will be delayed, but theoretically the growth stage of the grass would be similar. So yeah, I need to rediscover some of that theory, but it might be stem production. It could be that there's some, if you haven't cleaned the grass out well enough, there's more dead coming out, but I'm not sure it would reduce by 21%, as that study would show.
We've got a question about dead material. What are the implications of early grazing of pastures that were not grazed down tightly last year and have a lot of dead material in them? How should these be managed?
The issue with that will be, obviously, the dead material. What grows animals is green leaf. So if you've got a lot of dead in that, every time they take a mouthful of dead material, it will reduce their potential live weight gain. In reality, what we do is we put a lower class of stock on those fields if it's a significant problem. Alternatively, if you've got your wean cattle that you want to grow really quick, you push them through the fields and you make a second class of stock, possibly dry cows or autumn calf cows or something else to come behind them and clean that sward out. So you make them eat the slightly poorer quality feed, but you make sure the best quality feed is available to your highest priority of stock.
Okay, well, that brings us to the end of our questions. Thank you, everybody, for joining in today. We've had up to 40 people on the conference call this afternoon, so I hope you've all enjoyed it. Thank you both to our speakers, to Simon Marsh of Harper Adams and to our own Liz Genever from EBLEX. Thank you both for your time and your expertise. Those expert view sheets are available if you email us and request them at brpconf@eblex.ahdb.org.uk. Our next conference call will be the first Friday in March. Just looking at my calendar, that probably makes it the 6th of March at 1:30 p.m. So if you would like a reminder an hour before the conference call takes place, just email us again at brpconf@eblex.ahdb.org.uk and request a reminder, and we'll put you on the list to send you a reminder 1 hour before the call takes place. Everything that we've mentioned today is probably backed up by BRP manuals on the EBLEX website, so please avail yourself of those on the Better Returns Programme site. It's 2:20. We've just run over a little bit, but thank you all for your participation. I hope you've enjoyed it, and we look forward to joining in with you in a month's time. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks all. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.